London is not a beautiful city. Under the soot that covers its buildings is a teeming mass of 4 million souls trying to survive, mostly off of each other. You see it in the paper every day. Thankfully, we have the London Times to keep us informed of all these troubling activities with an unbiased eye and razor-sharp accuracy. We find this publication to be of invaluable assistance in our investigations, and I'm sure you will as well. Among the forces of evil which run rampant in this city, there are also, thankfully, 2 groups of individuals who will aid us in our cause. As we do, they attempt to right wrongs and restore harmony and civility to the streets of London. The first of these groups is a ragtag association of young ruffians. I call them the Baker Street Irregulars. Don't let them fool you. They may be scruffy and ill-bred, but they are on the right side of the law. They can go everywhere, see everything, and overhear everyone. They are my eyes and ears in the streets of London, unquestionably a tremendous asset in our work. They will help us in our investigations if they can. The other group is a far more civilized collection of gentlemen and institutions. I call them the Baker Street Regulars. They, too, will be extremely useful in our work. At the start of any investigation, do keep in mind that it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Unwittingly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. The people and places to whom I will now introduce you will help us to collect the facts. May we use them wisely. Come, the game's afoot.
What rubbish! What balderdash!
You must have read something terribly disturbing, Watson, for you to be so overwrought this early in the morning.
Indeed, Holmes. It's irresponsible of the Times to play upon people's superstitions.
Ah, you must be referring to the affair of the mummy's curse.
Has the entire city in an uproar. 3 men dead, and they expect us to believe that a 4,000-year-old mummy was the murderer. I'm surprised you haven't taken some interest in this case, Holmes.
To the contrary, my dear Watson. I have made some inquiries, because I dare say I do believe this murderer is a much younger chap.
It's quite amusing, all this hoopla over a mummy's curse, I must say. Not so amusing, of course, the murder of 3 Englishmen.
Have any of your reporters uncovered anything new?
Actually, I've been in Paris the past several weeks. Just returned to London on Tuesday. I've had no involvement with the writing of any of these articles. I believe they are all the work of Philip Travis. He's one of our young reporters. For a short time, he was the Egyptian correspondent.
Was he sacked?
No. He returned to London just a few days ago. I gather he was reassigned to cover the case from here because he had some familiarity with a murder in Egypt.
Do you know Travis?
No, never actually met the chap, although I hear he's a bit of an odd duck.
Thanks for your help, Henry.
Anytime. Let me know when you catch the mummy. That's one scoop I'd like to get.
Here is a passenger list you requested, sir.
Such a tragedy. Fine men all, and such outstanding scholars. I still can't quite get over the shock of it.
We understand.
Professor, we're looking for background information on these three men so that we can understand how their murders might tie together.
Well, let me begin with Dr. Turnbull. Ebenezer Turnbull was responsible for organizing the Carteret expedition. Quite a remarkable man, really. This was the first time he teamed up with James Windibank. Professor Windibank was one of our most popular lecturers. In fact, several of his former students were also eager to accompany him. I recall him saying that he was having difficulty choosing. Weatherby turned out to be the lucky one. Though it seems far from it now, doesn't it? I suppose Smith and Travis turned out to be the lucky ones after all.
Smith and Travis?
Peter Smith accepted the invitation to join another expedition. As for Philip Travis, he was quite keen on accompanying Professor Windibank. In fact, he became exceedingly upset when Andrew Weatherby, a postgraduate student in the department, was chosen instead. Took it rather personally, I should say.
I'm very sorry to intrude on you in your moment of grief.
Oh, that's quite all right. You know, Andrew and I hadn't been married very long.
Long enough to know if you had any enemies?
Oh, Andrew was so unassuming. Everyone liked him.
Including Mr. Urubaru?
I really loved my husband.
I'm sure you did. Oh, English toffee. My favorite.
Would you like one?
Please.
Sorry, you'll have to open this yourself. I've never been any good with these things.
Well, Holmes, I checked in with Mr. Al-Sad's manservant and...
And you discovered that Mr. Al-Sad was not at home.
But however did you know that?
Elementary, my dear Watson. I noticed some crumpet crumbs from the corner bakery stuck to your lapel. You haven't been gone long enough to stop for tea and interview anyone at length.
Most observant, sir.
Hello? Is anyone there? Mr. Farming, are you at home?
Apparently so, Watson. Look.
Oh, what ghastly business. Everyone will assume the mummy has struck again.
Hardly a plausible assumption. This poor fellow has a knife in his back and not a scrap of sheeting about his neck.
How very observant, Holmes.
Ring up Scotland Yard. This case is simple enough for them to solve.
You've solved it already.
Elementary, my dear Watson. Obviously, it was the butler.
Butler? What butler?
Exactly my point. A man as wealthy as Akram Fahmy would always have a manservant about him. After the foul deed, this one obviously beat a hasty retreat.
I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about the death of old... whatever his name was.
Andrew Weatherby.
Fact is, I only saw the gentleman once, just as we were boarding. And I'll tell you, I resented the first officer's questioning us on the matter, and I resent yours.
The whole voyage was a disaster from beginning to end. Our accommodations were positively abysmal. They wouldn't even let us bring Dickie into our cabin.
Dickie?
Her high-strung, distasteful little mutt.
How can you say that, Merrill? You know Dickie is a blue-blooded Yorkshire Terrier. Mumsy will be with you in just a moment, Dickiekins. He's a bit under the weather, you know. That's why we were only able to stay in Egypt for 2 weeks. Dickie was so disappointed. He so wanted to see the Sphinx.
Mr. Holmes is not interested in your incessant whining, Louise.
Oh, now I whine, do I? There was a time you thought I had a lovely speaking voice. It's true, Mr. Holmes. He once adored me.
No doubt.
Oh, for the love of God, Louise, spare us your blubbering.
Now, the thing what does strike me as odd is the passenger list of the Eastern Empress. Now, I'm not saying it has anything to do with the mummy murders, mind you, but it was a bit out of the ordinary.
What was Hogg?
Akram Palmy, for starters. He's a well-known importer, he is. For a considerable price by all accounts, he can acquire whatever one's heart desires, be it jewels, art objects, or even wild animals, if that's what you fancy. I'd say he was on board that ship to transport something very valuable.
The presence of one high-powered importer on a London-bound vessel is hardly reason for suspicion.
Right-o. But Abdullah al-Saud was also on board.
Oh, yes. The well-known agent for the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire.
You never miss a trick, do you, Holmes? Well, whatever it was what Palmy was carrying, I'd say it was something those Turks wanted to get their hands on.
Here it is, Holmes. Egyptian mummies are embalmed bodies preserved to facilitate their resurrection. Many mummies have been found, and they are almost always the bodies of pharaohs. The pharaohs believed that one day their bodies would be brought back to life. See History of Egyptian Mummies by Pettigrew, London, 1834.
Very good, Watson.
Beg your pardon, but could I have a word with you, Sir Jasper?
Ah, Dr. Watson, of course. Are you investigating the death of Samuel Sneed? I just finished with him.
No, we're interested in James Windibank.
Ah, the mummy's latest victim, of course. Who hired Holmes for this one? King Tut?
Oh, that's a jolly good one. Actually, we don't have a client on this one.
Just for fun, eh? Well, about the only thing I can tell you is that mummy has very powerful hands.
What do you mean?
The trachea was crushed along with one of the vertebrae of the neck. Death was instantaneous. Snap.
But the papers reports say that there were mummy wrappings found round the neck.
Just window dressing. Without question, it was bare hands. The bruises and the way that the vertebrae was crushed leave no doubt about that.
Thank you very much for your time, Sir Jasper. We're very much appreciative.
Not at all, Watson. You will let me know when you've convicted the mummy.
Beg your pardon?
Well, so I can perform an autopsy on him. Would be most fascinating, don't you think?
Pettigrew wrote this book over 50 years ago, and there's still nothing better on the subject. Fascinating. Just fascinating. And what can I do for you today, Whitson?
It's Watson, sir.
Watson, yes, of course.
We're interested in what you may have learned about this mummy case.
Oh, so these days it's mummies you're chasing down with that fella Holmes.
It's Holmes, sir.
This is what I said now, isn't it, Whitson?
Yes, I believe you did, sir.
Let me show you what I found so far. This is the bit of linen that was found round the neck of James Windibank. I examined it thoroughly, and it is quite old, perhaps thousands of years. However, it is not the murder weapon.
Are you certain of that?
Aye. The linen is quite old, but it's not at all strong enough to strangle a grown man.
Very interesting, sir.
I also found something quite fascinating. Take a look through this glass. Do you see those short hairs on the fabric?
They look precisely like hairs.
Of course they look like hairs. But what kind of hairs? They're not human hairs. They're dog hairs. Now, look at this. This piece of linen was found round the neck of the victim on board the ship. Well, his name was Leatherby or something. It is also quite old, and on it I found more hairs.
More dog hairs?
No, my dear man, monkey hairs. I've not yet been able to identify the precise species, but it's just extraordinary, isn't it?
Quite. But what do you think it all means?
Well, I'm not the sort who likes to jump to conclusions, Whitson. But I can assure you that neither of these bandages were the murder weapons.
We had just come through a rather grueling storm, so I sent my first officer, Luther Tenney, down into the hold to check on the condition of the cargo. He reported back post-haste that Mr. Weatherby was lying dead among the Egyptian artifacts we were transporting. I turned over the helm to Tenney and went below to have a look for myself.
And did what you see confirm Teddy's report?
Unfortunately, yes. Weatherby was lying next to that coffin, or whatever it's called, apparently strangled. I went back to the bridge and put Tenney in charge of the investigation.
And what did he uncover?
Well, you'll have to ask him for the specifics, because I can scarcely recall the details.
There was a couple of blokes in here just a fortnight ago what mentioned the Eastern Empress. Never seen 'em before, haven't seen 'em since. One was a swarthy fellow, Arab unless I miss my guess. The other was an old English gent. I overheard 'em say something about a bird and later caught the name of the ship. I hope that helps you. Care for a drink, yeah?
Let me tell you, a murder, even by a 4,000-year-old mummy, was only one odd thing in a string of bad luck on this voyage.
What sort of bad luck?
It all started with the crew, really. Seamen are a rather superstitious lot to begin with, and the idea carrying about a 4,000-year-old mummy had them shivering in their timbers. We almost faced a bloody mutiny. And there were the passengers, a strange lot. I can tell you that reporter fellow, Travis, did us no service at all with his mystic mumbo-jumbo. He and Professor Windibank had a regular war of words going on about whatever powers this mummy was supposed to have. And there was the two Arabs.
Arabs?
Interesting. Do you recall their names?
I should hope I do. One was called Farmy. He always carried around this curious little box. No clue what was in it, but Farmy never let it out of his sight. The other one's name was Al Sard, and he spent most of his time lurking about watching Farmy. My guess is he wanted that box.
Sounds like you had your hands full.
I haven't even told you about the fight yet between Mr. Weatherby and Mr. Urubaru.
Over what?
Weatherby's wife, I'd say, though they were a tight-lipped lot about it.
I see. Tell me, Lieutenant, we understand that you were the first person to discover the body.
Yes, sir, I was. Captain Ramsey sent me down to inspect the hold. And I went immediately over to them Egyptian crates. Professor Winterbank was particularly anxious about him, you know.
Could you describe the scene as you remember it?
I'll never forget it. I just made my way to the back of the hold, and I noticed at the top of them crates, the one what carried the mummy's coffin was raised up kind of funny like. The coffin lid was laid off to one side, and there was Mr. Weatherby all sprawled on the floor next to a bowl of ashes. He'd been strangled by a length of the mummy's sheeting. Bloody gruesome, I tell you. Poor bloke's eyes popped out like a couple of sausages on a hot iron skillet.
Quite a vivid picture, don't you agree, Holmes?
Quite. And you reported this to Captain Ramsey straight away?
Absolutely. In fact, the captain put me in charge of the entire investigation.
And what did you discover? Did anybody have any contact with Weatherby on the night of the murder?
Not that I know of. I could account for all the crew. The passengers were in their cabins as far as anyone knew or would say. Nobody saw anything, heard anything, or knew anything. Besides, Weatherby was seasick from the beginning. He stayed pretty much in his cabin all the time. Maybe that's why the lovely young Mrs. Weatherby was gallivanting about.
With Urubaru?
Yes, indeed.
And what of the bowl? Where is it now?
The bowl?
With the ashes.
Oh, yes. You know, now that you mention it, I don't recall ever seeing it again.
So you've been reading my articles in the Times. I'm honored. What do you think of them?
Quite interesting. You've clearly been following the murders quite closely. Who do you suspect?
I believe it is the work of the ancient Egyptian god Pumatef and his goddess Neith.
Be serious.
I couldn't be more serious. You see, Mr. Holmes, although I am a journalist, I was actually trained as an Egyptologist. I know all about these mysteries. That's why my articles carry the force of truth.
And what is the truth, Mr. Travis?
The truth is that the Egyptians discovered the secret of life. What we call science is mere child's play compared to the knowledge they had. Look at this. Do you know what this is?
It appears to be a mummified animal of some sort, a monkey perhaps.
Precisely.
Quite a conversation piece.
I've been using it in some very important experiments which, if successful, will unlock the secret for bringing back the souls of the dead. I've been working on it, Mr. Holmes, using these tanner leaves. Watch. Uma Lotus. Licantina. Burura.
It appears that the soul of this particular monkey has no intention of making a reappearance.
It's only a matter of time. I know it is. After all, these secrets have been buried for thousands of years. These things don't happen overnight. But it will happen someday. This is my mission.
I believe I'll leave you to your work, Mr. Travis.
Don't go yet. Let me show you more.
Thank you. Some other time, perhaps. If this is an inconvenient time, perhaps I could come back, Mr. Urubaru.
I wouldn't hear of it. Just a bit of a hangover. I've weathered plenty worse than this.
I'm investigating the death of Andrew Weatherby. You were on the ship with him out of Cairo. Did you happen to make his acquaintance?
Weatherby. A most tedious fellow.
So tedious, one might want to do him in.
Don't be preposterous. In my condition, I couldn't have done anything of the sort.
What condition was that?
And I thought you were a great detective. The first night out, a few of us threw a bit of a bash that went on until we docked in London.
Did Mrs. Weatherby attend this particular bash?
She was the guest of honor, you might say.
James was so thrilled when Dr. Turnbull invited him to join the expedition. He felt he had spent his entire life reading books about archaeology, and now was finally getting an opportunity to go out into the field.
Tell me, Mrs. Winterberg, when your husband returned, did he discuss the deaths of his colleagues?
Of course. James was extremely upset. I know he did not believe a curse to be responsible. My husband was a man of science.
Hear ye, hear ye. The Queen's Court now stands in order. Mr. Holmes, I understand you've been looking into the mummy murders.
Yes, my lord.
Tell me then, who was Ebenezer Turnbull's murderer? And what makes you so certain? What was Travis' motive for killing Turnbull? And what of Andrew Weatherby? Who murdered him? So, you say Travis killed Turnbull and Weatherby?
Yes, I believe he did, my lord.
But what was his motive to kill Weatherby, Mr. Holmes? Ah, revenge. The oldest motive in the book. Now, Mr. Holmes, who killed James Winterbank? This Travis seems to be quite a busy fellow. What made him kill James Winterbank? Well, you've done an admirable job in resolving this mystery. I'd say you're on a par with just about any other armchair detective out there. I would suggest, however, that you rethink this case again, thereby improving your sleuthing skills.
My word, dear Holmes. Perhaps we are in the wrong business altogether. If we had been top-notch, we should have cracked this case in less points. I think I'll ring up the university immediately and see if we might enroll in a detective course.
Well, Watson, I believe this case is solved. And for your information, it was not the mummy.
Come, Holmes. I never thought for a moment it was the mummy.
Of course not, Watson. However, the murderer and the mummy did have one thing in common.
What's that?
They both were the only ones present at the time of the murders, except, of course, the victims.
You state the obvious, Holmes.
Ah, but it is seeing the obvious that is important. First, I saw no reason to assume that we were dealing with more than one murderer. Secondly, the locations of the murders limited the number of suspects.
Limited them? The first murder was in Egypt, the second on ship in the middle of the sea, and the third in London. You call the entire populations of London and Egypt a limited number of suspects?
No, Watson. We had to find someone who was in Egypt for the first murder, on the ship for the second, and in London for the third.
Oh, but of course.
According to the newspapers, the Eastern Empress was in Bombay at the time of Ebenezer Turnbull's murder, so that eliminated the ship's crew as suspects. Thus, I needed the list of passengers who boarded the ship at Cairo. It was our visit to Jardine, Mason and Company that provided our first critical clue. From it, I learned that Philip Travis was a passenger. I then learned that Travis was the chap who reported on the first murder. He became one suspect, but I had no motive. Clarissa Weatherby, who was also at the scene of the murder in Cairo, was another possible suspect, since she appears to have had a bit of a dalliance with Mr. Uruburu there on the high seas. So I had found her motive for the murder of Weatherby, but not a motive for the murder of the others.
Then whom did you eliminate?
Mrs. Weatherby. Her hands were not strong enough even to open a jar of English toffee, let alone strangle a grown man.
And what of Travis's motive?
It seems that Travis was a student in the Egyptology department at London University and had studied under James Windibank. He wanted very badly to be chosen as a member of the expedition, but Windibank turned him down. Instead, Weatherby was chosen and Travis was furious. So there you have the motive for two of the murders.
And what of his motive for the murder of Turnbull?
Evidently, Travis had written a vicious article questioning Dr. Turnbull's credentials to lead the expedition. Turnbull's response was quite harsh, probably powerful enough to drive an odd duck like Travis to murder.
Very impressive, Holmes.
Elementary, my dear Watson.